The package arrived on a Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1878, strapped to the back of a horse, ridden by a man Rose Grady had never seen before in her life, and it would unravel every single thing she believed about the man she had buried 6 months ago. Rose was standing on the porch of her homestead just outside of Laramie, Wyoming, wringing out a wet cloth over the railing when she first spotted the rider coming up the long dirt road that cut through her land. The cottonwood trees had begun to shed their golden leaves, and they drifted across the trail in lazy spirals, parting around the horse's legs like water around stone. She straightened her back, shielding her eyes against the sharp autumn sun, and watched the stranger approach with the careful attention of a woman who had lived alone for half a year and had learned to read the intentions of visitors before they ever opened their mouths. He was tall in the saddle, broad across the shoulders, with a battered brown hat pulled low over his brow. His duster coat was trail-worn and dusty, the color of old clay, and there was nothing about him that seemed hurried or threatening. He rode the way men who had spent years on the open range rode, with a looseness in the hips and a quiet authority, as though the land beneath him was familiar even if the road was not. Tied across the back of his saddlebags was a rectangular parcel wrapped in brown paper and twine, weathered at the corners but intact. Rose set down her cloth and stepped off the porch, one hand resting near the shotgun she kept leaning against the door frame. She was 28 years old, dark-haired, with eyes the color of creek water in summer, and she had a directness to her gaze that most men found either disarming or unsettling. 6 months of managing a homestead alone had stripped away whatever softness grief might have left in her expression. The rider slowed his horse to a walk as he came within 30 yards of the house, and then he pulled the animal to a stop about 15 feet from where she stood. He tilted his hat back on his head so she could see his face properly, a square jaw, a few days of dark stubble, weathered skin from years of sun and wind, and a pair of steady brown eyes that looked at her with a kind of careful respect. He was maybe 30 or 31 years old, she guessed. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, and his voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not need to be raised to be heard. "I am looking for Rose Grady. Am I at the right place?" "Depends on who is asking," she said. "My name is Paul Graves. I was a friend of your husband, of Thomas Grady." He reached into his coat slowly, watching her hand near the shotgun, and produced a folded letter. "He asked me to bring you something before he passed. I would have come sooner, but the trail took longer than I expected, and I had some trouble in Colorado." He nodded toward the parcel on his saddlebags. "He sent this to a general store in Cheyenne for safekeeping, care of a mutual friend of ours. I picked it up 3 weeks ago and rode straight here." Rose's throat went tight. She stood very still for a moment, the wind moving through her hair, the leaves scratching past her boots on the dry ground. She had not spoken Thomas's name aloud in 2 months. She had trained herself not to, because when she did, the grief came back up like water from a flooded well, filling her chest until she could not breathe. "Thomas has been dead since March," she said carefully. 6 months ago." "Yes, ma'am," Paul said, and there was something genuine in his expression, a kind of quiet sorrow that was not performance. "I know. I was with him in Denver when he died. I am sorry for your loss. He was a good man." She looked at the parcel. She looked at the letter in his outstretched hand. She looked at the man himself, at the dust on his coat and the road-worn creases around his eyes, and she decided that he had not ridden however many miles he had ridden to cause her harm. She stepped forward and took the letter. "You can water your horse at the trough around the side of the house," she said, "and I suppose you had better come inside." Paul Graves dismounted with one fluid motion and led his horse, a bay gelding with a white blaze down its nose, around the side of the house, without a word of complaint. Rose went inside and set the letter on the kitchen table, pressing her hands flat against the worn wood on either side of it, staring at Thomas's handwriting on the envelope. Her name in his careful, slanted script. Rose, not Rose Grady. Just Rose, the way he had always called her. She had met Thomas Grady when she was 23 and he was 26, at a church social in the small Nebraska town where she had grown up. He had been passing through, working as a freight driver, moving goods across the plains with a wagon team he managed for a company out of Omaha. He was charming and broad-shouldered, and he told her stories about the territories that made her want to see them for herself. They had married 8 months later, and he had brought her west to the homestead in Laramie that he had staked a claim on the year before. 5 years of marriage. No children, though they had tried and hoped. And then Thomas had ridden out in the early days of February, telling her he had a freight run to Denver that would pay well and would only take a few weeks. He had never come back. A letter from Denver had arrived in March, written by a doctor, informing her that her husband Thomas Grady had passed from a sudden illness, a severe lung infection that had progressed quickly, and that he had been given a Christian burial in the city. She had read that letter so many times that the paper had softened along the fold lines until it felt like cloth. She heard Paul's boots on the porch steps and straightened up. When he knocked at the open door frame, she called him in, and he came into the kitchen, hat in his hands, and took the chair she gestured to without being asked twice. He set his hat on his knee and looked at the letter on the table between them with an expression she could not quite name. "How long did you know my husband?" she asked, sitting down across from him. "About 4 years," Paul said. "We worked some of the same freight routes out of Cheyenne. We were not close at the start, but we rode through some hard winters together, and that has a way of making men friends whether they intend to be or not." He paused. "He talked about you often, ma'am. About this place. About the garden you were trying to get established on the south side of the house." Rose glanced out the window toward the garden, which had produced exactly 6 squash and a modest row of turnips in its first real season. "He always had too much faith in my gardening abilities," she said, and was surprised to hear something almost like a laugh in her own voice. Paul smiled faintly. "He said you were stubborn enough to make the land listen." She looked down at the letter. "He sent this to a store in Cheyenne, before he died." "Yes, ma'am. He sent the parcel to a man named Eli Croft who kept a general store there. He and Eli had done business for years. He told Eli that if someone came asking with his name, they were to be given the package. He sent word to me in a letter about 10 days before he passed, asking me to collect it and bring it to you when I could." Paul's jaw tightened slightly. "I was in the middle of a long haul when I got his letter, and by the time I got back to a town with a telegraph office, he was already gone. I should have come sooner." "You are here now," Rose said quietly. She picked up the envelope. Her hands were steady, which surprised her. She had expected them to shake. She broke the wax seal. Thomas had pressed a coin into it, leaving an imperfect circle, and unfolded 2 sheets of paper covered in his handwriting. She read. The kitchen was very quiet. Paul sat without moving, his hat in his hands, looking at the wall or the window or his own boots, anywhere that was not the letter, anywhere that gave her privacy while she read. The letter was dated the 6th of February, 1878, which was 2 weeks before he had died. "My dearest Rose," he had written. "If you are reading this, then it has gone badly for me, and I am sorry for that in more ways than I can fit onto these pages. I have been feeling poorly for some days now, and a doctor here in Denver tells me my lungs are in a worse state than I have been letting on, and so I am writing this while I still can think clearly. I want you to know that I love you and have always loved you, and that the homestead in Laramie is the only home I have ever truly had. You made it that." She turned the page. "There is a second thing I must tell you, and I will not dress it up in softness because you have never liked that, and you deserve the plain truth. The parcel Paul will bring you contains the deed to a piece of land in the valley south of Laramie, which I purchased quietly 2 years ago with money I had saved from extra work I had taken on. I did not tell you about it because I wanted it to be a surprise, a real piece of ground for us to expand onto when the time was right, with good water access and better soil than what we have been struggling with on the northern slope. The money I used came from driving extra freight runs, mostly through the summer of 1876. I know you wondered where I was those long weeks. I told you the company needed extra hands. That was true, but the fuller truth is that I was working extra to put aside money for this. The deed is in your name, Rose. Always was from the moment I purchased it. Whatever happens to me, that land is yours, free and clear. There is one more thing. The man bringing you this, Paul Graves, is a good man. I trust him as much as I trust anyone outside of you. He has had a hard few years, and he does not always show what is inside of him easily, but he is honest to his core, and he would never leave a person without help if he could give it. I am asking him to check on you if he is able. I know you do not need anyone to check on you. I know that better than any man alive. But I am asking anyway, because you are going to be alone out there, and that is not what I wanted for you. Take care of the horses. Grease the axle on the wagon before winter because it has been complaining since September. All of my love until the stars go cold, Thomas. Rose set the letter down very carefully on the table, pressed her palms over it, and closed her eyes. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, 4 counts each, the way she had learned to do in the hardest weeks of March when the grief had been so heavy she had not been able to get out of bed until noon. When she opened her eyes, Paul Graves was looking at her with a kind of quiet steadiness that did not demand anything from her, not tears, not composure, not words. He just waited. He bought land, she said. That would be what the deed is for, Paul said gently. She almost laughed again, and this time a little of it actually escaped. It was a small, wondering sound. He never told me. He wanted it to be a gift. She looked at this man she had met 40 minutes ago, sitting in her dead husband's kitchen, and she felt something shift very slightly in the atmosphere between them. Not romance, not yet, nothing so simple or so fast as that. It was more like the sensation of ground settling after a long rain, like something finding its proper level. The parcel is still on your horse, she said. I can bring it in, please. He went out and came back with the brown paper parcel which he set on the table. She unwrapped it carefully, peeling back the layers of paper, and inside there was a tin box sealed with a small lock, and alongside it a key tied to a piece of red ribbon. She used the key and opened the box. Inside was the deed just as Thomas had described, folded neatly and tied with a second ribbon, and beneath it a daguerreotype photograph in a small oval frame, a photograph of herself and Thomas taken on their wedding day in Nebraska, which she had not known he possessed a copy of. And beneath the photograph, wrapped in a square of soft cloth, was her mother's silver thimble, which she had believed she had lost 3 years ago and had grieved quietly but never mentioned. She picked up the thimble. She stared at it. He kept it, she whispered. He found it and he kept it, and he was going to give it back to me. She pressed the thimble to her mouth, and this time she did cry, briefly and quietly, her shoulders lifting once and then settling. Paul did not say anything. He did not reach across the table. He simply sat there, present and unhurried, and when she set the thimble down and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, he refilled her tin cup from the pot of coffee on the stove without being asked, and set it in front of her. It was such a simple, thoughtful thing to do that it caught her entirely off guard. "Thank you," she said. "Of course," he said, and sat back down. They talked for a long time after that, as the afternoon light moved across the kitchen floor, and the shadows of the cottonwoods stretched long and golden outside the windows. She asked him about Thomas, about the freight routes and the friends they had shared, and what Thomas had been like in those last weeks. Paul told her what he could with care and honesty, neither embellishing nor withholding. Thomas had been in good spirits until the illness took hold quickly, he told her. He had spoken of Rose and the homestead with a warmth that never diminished. He had not suffered long, which Paul seemed to understand was what she most needed to know. In return, she told him about the homestead, the struggles of the past 6 months, the axle on the wagon that she had in fact greased in October because Thomas's letter had been right about it, the garden that had yielded its modest harvest, the 2 horses she had kept shod and fed through the summer. She told him these things not to impress him, but because he asked with genuine interest, and she found that talking to him was unexpectedly easy, like speaking to someone who had known her longer than he actually had. By the time the sun touched the western ridgeline, she had offered him supper and a night in the barn, and he had accepted both with quiet gratitude. She made cornbread and salt pork and a pot of beans, and they ate at the kitchen table with the tin box between them, the daguerreotype leaning against it so Thomas's photographed face looked out at them both. It was an odd thing, that presence, but not an unwelcome one. "He said you had a hard few years," she said, soaking up the last of her beans with the cornbread. "You mentioned trouble in Colorado." Paul was quiet for a moment, turning his tin cup in his hands. "I lost my wife 2 years ago," he said. "She was from a ranching family outside of Fort Collins. She died in childbirth and the child with her." He said it flatly, but she heard the weight under the words, the kind of flatness that was not emptiness but endurance. "After that I went back to freight work because it kept me moving, and moving kept me from thinking too much." "I understand that," Rose said. "After Thomas died, I stayed as busy as I could, kept finding things to fix that did not necessarily need fixing. The wagon axle, the fence on the east side, the roof over the back room." She paused. "Work is honest. It does not ask you questions." "No," Paul agreed. "It does not." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and outside the wind moved through the cottonwoods with a sound like distant water. The lamp on the table flickered. "The trouble in Colorado," Rose said. "Was it serious?" Paul looked at her with an expression that measured something, then seemed to decide. "There was a man who had been skimming from the freight company I worked for out of Pueblo. He discovered I had noticed the discrepancy in the ledgers, and he decided it would be simpler to make sure I did not reach anyone to report it to. I had a few days of unpleasant company before I managed to put some distance between us." He touched his left side briefly, where his coat closed over his ribs. Nothing that a few weeks of proper eating and not riding at a full gallop did not eventually fix. "You were shot," Rose said. "Grazed," he said. "There is a meaningful distinction." She looked at him steadily. "There is also a meaningful distinction between grazed and not shot at all." He smiled at that, and it transformed his face in a way she had not expected. It softened all that weathered seriousness and made him look younger, genuinely warm, like sunlight finding a gap in cloud cover. "You are direct," he said. "Thomas always called it an economy of words," she said. "He was right," Paul said, still smiling. "It is a gift." She showed him to the barn, lit a lantern for him, pointed out where the extra blankets were kept in a chest near the tack room. He thanked her with the same unhurried politeness that had characterized everything he did, and she walked back to the house through the cool autumn dark with an odd feeling in her chest that she could not immediately name. She lay in bed for a long time that night with the silver thimble in her hand, turning it between her fingers in the dark. She thought about Thomas, about his laugh and his stubbornness, and the way he had always overestimated her gardening and correctly estimated her resilience. She thought about the piece of land sitting somewhere south of here with her name on the deed, a gift she had never known was coming, delivered 6 months after the giver was gone. She thought about Paul Graves sitting in her kitchen with his hat in his hands, refilling her coffee cup without making a production of it. She was not, she told herself firmly, going to be foolish about this. A stranger had come with a package. He would move on. That was the nature of men who rode freight routes. They moved. She fell asleep with the thimble still in her hand. In the morning she woke to the smell of coffee already made and went into the kitchen to find Paul at her stove, moving with the careful, non-presumptuous manner of a man who understood he was in someone else's space. He had made a full pot and was standing back from it, not touching anything else. "I hope you do not mind," he said when she appeared in the doorway. "I was up early and I found the coffee tin, and it seemed like the least I could do." "I do not mind," she said, and it was true. They had breakfast together. She made eggs from her small flock of chickens, and he ate with the thoroughness of a man who had been surviving on trail food for weeks, and then she spread the deed from Thomas's tin box on the table between them and studied it properly for the first time. The land was in the valley south of Laramie, just as Thomas had written, about 12 miles from where they sat. It was 40 acres, with a creek cutting through the eastern portion of the property, and a notation on the deed that mentioned seasonal grass coverage. She had ridden past that valley before, years ago, and she remembered thinking that the soil looked dark and rich compared to the pale, thin ground of the northern slopes where she had been trying to farm. "Do you know how to read a land deed?" she asked Paul. "Well enough," he said, leaning over beside her to look at it. He was close enough that she could smell trail dust and wood smoke, and something else that was simply human warmth, and she found it neither unpleasant nor unsettling. "The boundary markers are written here: creek on the east, the ridgeline on the west, 2 set survey stakes on the north and south ends." He traced the lines with one finger, not touching the paper. "This is properly registered. He filed this with the Territorial Land Office. This is real, Mrs. Grady." Rose. She almost corrected him. She had been Rose to herself for 28 years, and Mrs. Grady still sometimes sounded like a stranger's name, but she let it go for now. 40 acres of good bottom land, she said, half to herself. He was always thinking 3 steps ahead. Her voice caught slightly on the last word, and she smoothed it over quickly. "I would like to see it." Paul looked at her. "I could ride out there with you if you wanted. I have the time." She considered this. She considered the fact that he was, by any reasonable account, still a stranger, and that riding 12 miles with a stranger was not something she did carelessly. She also considered his quietness and his steadiness, and the way Thomas had written about him in a letter meant only for her eyes. Trust him, Thomas had said, essentially. And Thomas had known people with the accuracy of someone who had spent years reading the character of men on long trail routes, where there was nowhere to hide what you actually were. "All right," she said. "We will ride out tomorrow. Today I have fence work to finish on the east side." "I can help with that," Paul said immediately. She opened her mouth to say that she did not need help, which was true, and then closed it again. Because not needing help was different from not wanting it, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she would not mind the company. "If you want something to do," she said carefully. "I would," he said simply. They spent the day working the eastern fence line together, replacing 3 broken posts and restringing wire where the cattle from the neighboring property, a rancher named Aldous Webb, who was gruff but not unkind, had pushed through and bent the lower strands. Paul worked efficiently and without complaint, following her lead on where the repairs were needed rather than assuming he knew better, and by mid-afternoon they had covered the full length of the fence line that she had been slowly working through alone. There was something companionable about it, the rhythm of shared work, the way conversation came and went naturally between bouts of effort rather than being forced. He told her about the territories he had traveled through: northern Wyoming, parts of Colorado, the flat stretching plains of Kansas that went on until the sky and the ground seemed to be the same thing. She told him about her childhood in Nebraska, about her father's small farm and her mother's kitchen garden, about the way she had wanted to go west since she was 12 years old and had stood on the roof of the barn on a clear night and looked out at the horizon and felt it pulling her. "Thomas gave me that," she said, hammering a post into the dark soil. "Whatever else there is to say about everything, he gave me that. He brought me west. What do you love about it?" Paul asked, holding the post steady while she worked. It was a genuine question, asked without any particular design, and she liked that about him, the genuineness. "The scale of it," she said after a moment. "The sky out here is not the same sky as back east. It is bigger. It makes you feel smaller, but in a way that is good, not frightening. Like being reminded that you are part of something that does not care about your small troubles." She stepped back and checked the post. "And the land. The way it demands real work and pays you back honestly for what you put in. There is no pretending out here. The land does not pretend, and eventually neither do the people." Paul was quiet for a moment, looking out over the open ground toward the ridgeline. "That is exactly it," he said. I have never heard it said that clearly." She looked at him, and he was looking at the land with something in his expression that she recognized, because she had seen it in her own face in the mirror, a kind of belonging that had nowhere else to go. The next morning they rode south together through the long golden light of early October, following the wagon track out of Laramie, and then cutting south where the track became a narrow trail threading between stands of juniper and scrub oak. Rose rode her mare, a gray named Thistle, and Paul rode his bay Gelding, and they traveled at an easy pace that did not hurry the horses or the conversation. The valley opened up around them gradually, the hills parting like cupped hands, and there below was the bottomland Thomas had bought 40 acres of dark, grass-covered ground with the creek threading silver through the eastern edge, cottonwoods standing tall along its banks, and the whole of it lying quiet and golden in the autumn sun. Rose pulled Thistle to a stop at the crest of the last rise and looked down at it without speaking for a long moment. "He chose well," she finally said. "He did," Paul agreed, pulling his bay up beside her. "That grass is still green along the creek. This late in October, that says something about the water access." She rode down into the valley slowly, threading between clumps of bunchgrass, letting Thistle pick her way carefully. She crossed the creek at a natural ford where the stones were flat, and the water was clear and ran about knee-deep on the horses. On the far bank she dismounted and crouched at the edge of the water, trailing her fingers in the cold current, looking at the way the light fell through the cottonwood leaves above her. Paul dismounted a few yards away and gave the horses room to drink, and he did not crowd her with words or presents. He understood, she thought, that this moment was between her and the land and between her and Thomas in some way that could not be explained to an outside party. She stood up eventually and looked around at the full sweep of the property, the dark soil, the good grass, the creek, the shelter of the valley walls on either side. "I am going to build something here," she said. "Not just survive, but build." "You could do it," Paul said, and he said it without performance or flattery. He said it the way a person states a plain fact. She looked at him across the space between them, this man who had come to her with a package her dead husband had sent. And she felt something she had not felt in 6 months, something tentative and inconvenient and entirely unwanted, and also, if she was honest with herself, not entirely unwelcome. She looked away and brushed her hands against her skirt and said they should ride the boundary line so she could understand the full shape of the property, and he agreed, and they spent another 2 hours doing exactly that. And if she noticed that she kept finding reasons to ask his opinion, and that she listened to his answers more carefully than strictly necessary, she did not remark on it. They rode back to the homestead in the long blue dusk, and she made supper again, and they ate again, and the conversation moved easily between practical things. Her plans for the land, the coming winter, whether she should try to find a hired hand in the spring, and less practical things, like the way the stars out here seemed close enough to touch, and whether there was any place in the world as beautiful as Wyoming in October, and what they each would do if they had the freedom to do anything they chose. "I would stay in one place long enough to know it properly," Paul said, surprising her. "I have been moving for 4 years and I have seen a great deal, but I do not know any of it deeply. I know the surfaces of places but not their cores." "This place has a core," Rose said. "I can see that," he said, and he looked at her when he said it in a way that made her think they might not entirely have been talking about the homestead. She told herself she was imagining things. He had been here 2 days. He was a stranger. He was a friend of her dead husband. She was still grieving, which meant her judgment about certain things was not to be fully trusted. She told herself all of this very firmly, and then dreamed about the creek on the new land, sparkling in clear autumn sunlight, which was a dream about a creek and nothing more. On the 3rd morning he came to the door of the house while she was mending harness leather and said, with a careful straightforwardness, that he ought to think about moving on. He had a freight run to get back to out of Cheyenne, and the company would not hold the route for him indefinitely. She felt something drop in her stomach, which she identified as the entirely reasonable feeling of a woman who had, for the first time in 6 months, had reliable companionship, and who was now losing it again. That was all it was. "Of course," she said. "You have done what you came to do and more besides." He nodded, turning his hat in his hands again. That hat turning, she had noticed, was the one outward sign of whatever was happening inside him that he permitted himself. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it plainly because I think you appreciate plain speech." "I do. Thomas asked me to check on you, and I have done that, and I am glad I did. But I want to be clear that I would like to come back and check on you again, if you would allow it, and that has nothing to do with Thomas's request." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not entirely sure what it does have to do with, and I would not insult you by pretending I am certain of it at this early stage, but I would like to come back." Rose set down the harness and looked at him. The morning light came through the open door behind him and lit the edges of his coat and the side of his face. "You are honest," she said. "I try to be. Thomas said you were." He waited. "Come back then," she said, "when you have the time." She picked up the harness again and went back to her mending. "Ride safe, Mr. Graves." "Paul," he said. She looked up. He was almost smiling. "Ride safe, Paul," she said. He left on the 4th morning, and the homestead went quiet again in a way she had not expected. She had not thought 3 days would make a difference to the texture of the quiet, but it had. The silence felt different now, not empty exactly, but aware of an absence in a way it had not been before his arrival. She shook her head at herself and went out to feed the horses. The weeks that followed were busy ones, as October gave way to November and the first serious cold moved down from the north. She winterized the homestead, banking the foundation with straw bales, checking the chimney flue, laying in firewood and supplies from Laramie's general store, driven in by wagon on what turned out to be the last mild day before the first snow. She went to Laramie for supplies twice more, and on the second trip she stopped at the land office and stood before the clerk, a bespectacled young man named Harrington who smelled of ink and looked startled whenever a woman addressed him directly, and had him confirm that the deed Thomas had sent her was properly registered and valid. It was 40 acres in the valley south of town, registered in the name of Rose Grady, fully paid and unencumbered. She walked out of the land office into the thin November sunshine with the deed in her bag and stood on the boardwalk for a moment, watching the town move around her, wagons in the street, horses at the hitching posts, a group of cowboys from one of the big cattle operations coming out of the saloon across the way, and 2 Shoshone women walking quietly along the far side of the road with baskets over their arms, moving through the town that had been built on land that had once been theirs, treated as though they were part of the background rather than people. It was an injustice that sat badly with her every time she saw it, the casual erasure of people who had been here long before any deed was ever filed. She went home to the homestead and began the serious work of planning the spring. Paul's first letter arrived in mid-November. It came with the mail rider who made the circuit out to the outlying homesteads every 2 weeks, a weathered man named Bert who had been doing the route for 15 years, and treated every piece of mail he carried as though it were sacred, which Rose had always appreciated about him. He handed her a folded letter with her name on the front in handwriting that was not Thomas's, and she stood there in the cold air for a moment looking at the unfamiliar script before she understood. Inside, Paul wrote, "Mrs. Grady Rose, I am writing from Cheyenne, where the freight company has me loading a full wagon for a run to Laramie, and points north before the serious winter sets in. I have been thinking about your bottomland and the creek, and whether you have thought about what crop you might trial there in the spring. The soil color suggests good organic matter, which means you might get a real corn yield if the season cooperates. I also wanted to ask, for reasons that are not strictly practical, whether you and the horses and the garden are all well." She read it twice standing in the cold, and then she went inside and wrote back immediately. She told him the horses were well and the garden was cleared and banked for winter, and that she had been thinking about the bottomland as well, and that she was leaning toward corn on the lower portion, and perhaps some kitchen vegetables near the creek where the water access was easy. She told him that the squash from this year's garden had lasted better in storage than she had expected, and that she considered this a personal victory. She told him that Laramie was quiet in November but not unpleasantly so, and that she had been reading by the fire in the evenings, and finding it less solitary than it had been in the worst months of spring. She did not tell him that she had looked at the seat across the kitchen table several times in the past weeks, and found herself thinking about the way he had sat there, unhurried and present. She sent the letter back with Bert on his return run and then went to make supper, and the fire in the hearth was warm and steady, and the wind rattled the windows in a friendly rather than threatening way. And she felt, for the first time in many months, something that she cautiously identified as forward-looking. His second letter arrived in early December, and hers crossed it in transit, so they were briefly both waiting on replies at the same time, which led to a funny moment in his third letter, where he described imagining their letters passing each other somewhere on the prairie in the middle of the night, the words traveling in opposite directions. She found herself smiling at that, genuinely and fully, in a way that surprised her. He came back in late December. He appeared at her door on a Wednesday afternoon, 2 days before Christmas, with snow on his coat and his hat and his horse's back, carrying a small bag and the same quiet steadiness she had remembered. He had been in the area on a freight run that ended in Laramie, he explained, and he had not wanted to pass within 12 miles of her homestead without stopping. She had made a small Christmas wreath from juniper branches and hung it on the door, and he looked at it and then at her and smiled. "You have been busy," he said. "Come in out of the cold," she said. He stayed for 4 days this time. They covered more ground in those 4 days than she could quite account for. Afterward conversations that went long into the evenings, stories traded across the supper table, a ride out to the bottomland in the snow that transformed the valley into something that looked like a painting, all white and blue and silver, the creek still running black beneath a thin skim of ice at its edges. They talked about his wife, Margaret, and she told him more about Thomas than she had allowed herself to say aloud before, and something about the equal weight of grief on both sides of the table made it possible to speak honestly without it being a performance of sorrow. They had both loved people and lost them. They were both still here. On Christmas Eve she made a proper dinner with a brace of quail she had shot herself. She had learned to handle a shotgun in the autumn, partly for safety, and partly because a woman alone on a homestead with 2 horses and a piece of land needed to know how to put meat on her own table. And they sat by the fire afterward with cups of coffee laced with a small measure of whiskey that she kept in the back of the pantry for medicinal purposes only, which was the story she intended to maintain. He told her about growing up in Ohio, the son of a carpenter. She told him about Nebraska, her father's farm, the smell of her mother's bread in the winter kitchen. They talked about what they wanted, the kind of wanting that was not about immediate things but about the shape of a life. "I want permanence," he said quietly, looking into the fire. "I want to stop waking up in different places and not knowing where I am before I open my eyes. I want to know where I am before I open my eyes." She looked at the side of his face, the firelight moving across it, and she felt the warmth in her chest that she had been carefully not naming for 6 weeks now rising up with a clarity that was no longer easy to dismiss. "I know where I am before I open my eyes," she said. "I have known since I first came here. This is home." He turned to look at her, and they were very close to the fire, close to each other, and the evening was quiet around them except for the settling of the logs and the far-off sound of the winter wind. "Rose," he said, and the way he said her name was different from the way he had said it before. It had a different weight to it. "Not yet," she said gently. "I am not saying no. I am saying not yet." He nodded. There was nothing hurt in his expression, nothing that demanded she justify the caution, nothing that made her feel she had done something wrong. He just nodded and looked back at the fire, and after a moment he said, "I understand that," and she believed him. He left the day after Christmas, and she stood on the porch in the cold and watched him ride away down the snow-covered track until he was just a dark shape against the white, and then gone. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a warm cup and looked at the chair across from her. Not yet, she had said, but she had not said never. And she thought about that distinction for a long time in the January quiet. The winter passed the way Wyoming winters do, in long cold spells broken by brief, brilliant days when the sun came out, and the snow on the hills turned to pure white fire, and in evenings by the fire with books and mending and letters that traveled back and forth between her homestead and wherever Paul was at any given time. He moved Cheyenne, Denver briefly, north to a place in Montana that he described as magnificent and miserable in equal measure. But the letters kept coming, regular and reliable, and she kept writing back. She told him everything, or nearly everything. She told him about the plans she was drawing up for the bottomland, about the seed catalogs she had ordered from back east, about the conversation she had had with Aldous Webb next door, who had agreed to sell her 2 more laying hens for a fair price, and had also, in his gruff way, told her that he thought she was managing the homestead better than most men he knew, which she had taken as the high compliment it was meant to be. She did not tell him, in any direct way, that she had started to look at the second chair at her kitchen table differently, that it no longer looked like an empty place and more like a place being held. February came, and with it the first anniversary of Thomas's death. She went out to the bottomland on that day by herself, riding Thistle through the slushy late winter mud, and she stood by the creek and spoke to Thomas, quietly thanked him for the land, thanked him for the thimble, thanked him for Paul Graves, which was a strange thing to thank a dead man for but which seemed necessary. She told him she was going to be all right, which she was now confident of, and she told him she was going to make something of the valley land that would be worth making. She rode home in the thin February dusk, feeling lighter than she had in a year. In March, a letter arrived from Paul that was different from the others in a way she felt before she had fully read it, something in the directness of the opening lines, something in the spare, careful way he had chosen every word. He wrote, "I have been offered a position managing a freight depot in Laramie, permanent, with a house included in the arrangement. I have not accepted it yet. I did not want to accept it before I knew whether there was any reason, beyond the practicalities of a stable job in a good town, to be in Laramie. I am asking plainly, because I think you deserve plain questions, and because I would rather be clearly refused than vaguely encouraged. Is there a reason to be in Laramie?" She read the letter 3 times. Then she sat down and wrote back immediately. She wrote, "Yes." She wrote it and then she added, "Come in spring when the mud has cleared and the creek on the Southland is running full. I want to show you what the valley looks like in April." And then, because she was not a woman who did things halfway once she had decided, she added, "I want you to see what I am building and I want you to build it with me if that is something you want. That is as plain as I know how to say it." She sent the letter with the next mail rider and then spent approximately 3 days being completely calm and entirely sensible about the whole thing, during which she repaired the roof over the back room, organized the seed inventory she had been accumulating since January, and cleaned every pot in the kitchen to a shine that was, if she was honest, completely unnecessary. His response came in 2 weeks. It said, "April. I will be there." April in Wyoming is not the gentle spring of the eastern states. It is turbulent and wide-awake, full of cold mornings and brilliant afternoons and sudden storms that blow in from the mountains without warning, and the creeks run high and loud with snowmelt, and the grass comes up green with a speed that seems almost willful, like it has been waiting impatiently under the snow all winter. Paul rode in on a Thursday morning in the second week of April, when the cottonwoods along the creek were just beginning to show their first pale green leaves, and the meadowlarks had come back to the lower pasture. He looked better than he had in December, less trail-worn, though still lean and weathered in the way that the West made men, and he rode with the same loose ease in the saddle that she had noticed the very first day. She was in the kitchen garden when she heard the horse and came around the side of the house, wiping her hands on her apron, and he had already dismounted at the front and was standing with his reins in his hand, and his hat pushed back from his forehead, looking at the place with an expression she could only describe as arrived. "You came," she said. "I said I would," he said, and smiled at her. Not the brief, careful smile of their early acquaintance, but a full, open, genuine smile that she felt somewhere behind her ribs. She walked up to him and held out her hand, and he shook it, which was entirely proper and also entirely insufficient, and they both seemed to know it because they both laughed a little, which broke the formality of the moment into something easier and warmer. "Come see the kitchen garden," she said. "The turnips are already coming up." He followed her around to the garden, and she showed him the turnips and the onion sets she had planted and the corner where she intended to try tomatoes. And then she made coffee and they sat on the porch in the April sunlight and talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing. And the ease between them had deepened over the winter months of letters into something that felt solid, like ground that had been tested and held. That afternoon she took him to the valley. The creek was running full, just as she had described in her letter, loud and silver clear, and the grass on the bottomland was already green and lush. The air smelled of water and earth and new grass and something cleaner than the air most places, and they stood together at the water's edge for a long time without needing to say very much about it. "I am going to break ground on the south portion in May," she said. "Corn on the lower flat, kitchen vegetables near the creek, and I want to try a small apple orchard on the slope. The microclimate in the valley should protect the trees from the worst of the frost." He looked at the slope, calculating the angle of it, the way it caught the afternoon sun. "You would need to mound the planting holes for drainage," he said. "But yes, it should work. Particularly if you chose varieties from the northern nurseries." "I already wrote to a nursery in Colorado," she said. He looked at her with something warm and amused in his eyes. "Of course you did. Was I supposed to wait?" "No," he said. "No, you absolutely were not." They walked the full property in the afternoon light, following the creek downstream to where it bent around the base of the west ridge and then back up along the top of the property boundary. He asked good questions and she had thought through enough of the plans to answer most of them, and when she did not have an answer she said so, and they thought about it together, which she found she liked more than having all the answers herself. On the way back to the homestead, riding side by side through the evening gold, he said, "Rose, I want to ask you something." "All right," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the trail ahead, and she waited. She had learned that he was a man who gathered his words before he used them, and that what came out of the gathering was worth waiting for. "I have been thinking about what you wrote," he said, "about building something together. I want that. I want it more plainly than I have wanted anything in a long time, and I think you know that." He glanced at her. "I also know this is complicated, that there is a great deal of Thomas in this place and in your life, and I would not want you to think I am asking you to put that away. I am not. But I am asking whether, in addition to the building and the corn and the apple orchard, there is a place in this for me as a person, not just as a useful hand with a fence line." She had known this question was coming for months, and she had spent months preparing an answer that was honest and careful and appropriately measured. And when the moment arrived, she set all of that aside. "There has been a place for you since last October," she said. "I have just been making sure it was the right thing to say out loud." He pulled his horse to a stop on the trail and she stopped beside him, and they were very close in the narrowing of the path between the juniper trees, and the evening light was long and warm. "Is it the right thing?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "It is." He reached across the space between them and took her hand, and she let him, and he held it for a moment with a quietness that was more meaningful than any declaration. And then they rode on toward home in the warm evening, and the horses walked easy, and the meadowlarks called from the lower pasture, and it was the simplest and most complete moment Rose Grady could remember in a very long time. He took the position at the freight depot in Laramie and moved into the house that came with it, a small, solid house on the edge of town, closer to the depot than to anything else. And in the weeks that followed, they established a rhythm that felt natural and unforced, moving between her homestead and his house in town with the easy familiarity of people who had already done the harder work of knowing each other and found it satisfactory. He came to the homestead on his days off from the depot, and on those days they worked the bottomland together, breaking the South Flat by hand with a borrowed plow and 2 horses and a great deal of sustained effort. The soil was everything the dark color had promised, deep and workable, full of the kind of richness that came from centuries of creek flood and grass decay. And the corn went in by mid-May in long straight rows that she had measured out with a rope and a pair of stakes, methodical and precise. The apple tree saplings from Colorado arrived in late May, wrapped in damp burlap, and they planted them together on the western slope in the long spring evenings, Paul mounding the holes for drainage and Rose setting each tree with the care of someone planting a promise. There were 12 trees, 6 varieties, all suited to a mountain climate, and they planted them in 2 rows with enough spacing to allow full canopy growth in 10 years, which was a long-term thinking that required a certain kind of confidence in the future. In 10 years these will be producing, Paul said, patting the soil down around the last tree. In 10 years, Rose agreed, looking at the row of small saplings, their thin trunks barely as thick as her wrist. He looked at her with something very quiet and steady in his expression. "I plan to be here in 10 years, he said, "to see it." "I know," she said, and she did. She was not a woman who rushed toward things, but she was also not a woman who was afraid of them. In early June, on a clear afternoon when the bottomland was showing its first rows of corn, and the apple saplings were putting out their first tentative leaves and the creek was running easy after the snowmelt rush, she told him that she thought they should get married. She said it the way she said most things, directly, without elaborate setup. He stared at her for a full 3 seconds. "Are you proposing to me?" He said, "I am stating what I think ought to happen," she said. "You can call it what you like." He laughed out loud, a full, surprised laugh that echoed off the valley walls, and it was the best sound she had heard in a very long time. Then he came to her and took both her hands and looked at her with a warmth that she thought she could live inside of quite comfortably for the rest of her life. "Yes," he said, "absolutely yes, since we are being direct about it." They were married in July, on a Saturday, in the small white Methodist church in Laramie, where the minister was a round-faced man named Reverend Albright, who performed the ceremony with great enthusiasm and a tendency to go slightly long on the scripture readings, which both Rose and Paul endured with patient good humor. Aldous Webb came from next door, bringing his wife Edna, a cheerful, robust woman who wept happily through the whole ceremony and pressed a jar of her best preserved peaches on Rose afterward as a wedding gift. 2 women Rose had become friendly with in town, Clara Hendricks and May Park, came as well, dressed in their Sunday best, and Eli Croft from the Cheyenne General Store, Thomas's friend, the one who had kept the parcel all those months, made the trip down especially, which touched Rose deeply. She wore a dress she had made herself from good blue cotton, and she carried a handful of the wildflowers that grew along the bottomland creek, and she said her vows in a clear voice without a tremor, and Paul said his with the same quiet steadiness that had been, she now recognized, the first thing she had trusted about him. It was not a large ceremony. It was not a showy one. But it was entirely real, and when Reverend Albright pronounced them husband and wife, Paul kissed her with a gentleness that was somehow also entirely certain, and she felt it in all of her. They had a small supper at the homestead afterward, with Edna Webb's peaches on the table alongside Rose's cornbread, and a pot roast that Clara Hendricks had contributed. And Aldous Webb told several stories about frontier life that were almost certainly exaggerated but very entertaining. And Eli Croft turned out to have a fine singing voice which he demonstrated after supper with a folk song that made everyone quiet, and a little bit happily sad in the way that good folk songs do. When everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Rose and Paul sat on the porch in the warm July dark with cups of coffee and listened to the crickets and the far-off sound of the creek in the lower pasture. "We are married," Paul said, as if testing the fact of it. "We are," Rose agreed. He reached over and took her hand without ceremony, and they sat like that in the summer dark, and above them the Wyoming sky was enormous and full of stars, the same stars she had looked at from her father's barn roof in Nebraska when she was 12 years old and felt the West pulling at her. She had gotten here. She had found it. And now, she thought, it was really beginning. The months that followed were the fullest Rose could remember. Paul moved out of the house in town and into the homestead, which was the practical decision, and he kept the depot position for the income it provided, while they worked the bottomland property on evenings and weekends, and on the extended days off he negotiated with his employer. The homestead itself needed expanding, a second bedroom added to the back of the house, which Paul framed and roofed over 2 weekends in late summer with help from Aldous Webb, who turned out to be a skilled hand with a hammer when properly motivated and paid in Edna's cooking. The corn came in August, a real harvest, not enormous but meaningful, and Rose spent 2 full days shucking and drying a good portion of it for winter meal, while Paul loaded the fresh ears for sale in Laramie, negotiating a fair price with the grain merchant on Main Street. They celebrated the first harvest from the bottomland with a dinner that was more elaborate than anything. Rose usually made roasted chicken from her own flock, the last of the summer vegetables, and a corn pudding that used some of the new harvest and turned out better than she had hoped. She told him at supper, setting down her fork and looking at him across the table, that there was going to be a baby. Paul set down his own fork and looked at her with an expression that moved through surprise and then through something very deep and still, and his eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before. "When?" he asked. "February, I think," she said, "if my counting is right." He got up from his chair and came around the table and pulled her to her feet and held her carefully and completely, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt the warmth of him surrounding her, and the house was very quiet and full of something enormous and good. "February," he said, his voice slightly rough. "February," she confirmed. He stepped back and looked at her with a joy that was simple and unperformed. "I am very glad," he said. "So am I," she said, and she was, more than she had expected, more than she had allowed herself to anticipate. She was. The autumn was a busy one. The second bedroom addition was completed and properly insulated before October, because Paul had decided that the new room would become the nursery, and he began planning it with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to everything. A proper window on the south side for light, a good floor without gaps where cold air could seep, a solid door frame that would not warp in the winter expansion and contraction of the wood. Rose thought, watching him measure and plan, that Thomas would have liked Paul Graves very much. They were different in many ways. Thomas had been more talkative, more easily charmed by a story or a joke, quicker to laugh, but they shared something at their core that she recognized. A basic honesty, a care for things that mattered, a willingness to do the actual work. She kept Thomas's photograph on the mantel, and Paul never suggested moving it, and she thought about that and loved him for it without making a production of loving him for it. She wrote in her journal on a November evening, with the fire going and the winter wind sounding against the windows, "I did not expect any of this. Not the land in the valley, not Paul Graves arriving at my door with a package, not this life taking the shape it is taking. Thomas, who knew me better than I knew myself in some ways, seems to have been 3 steps ahead of me even at the end. There is something in that which is not sad at all. There is something in it that is exactly like him." The winter was long and cold and contained within it many evenings by the fire, reading aloud to each other from the small collection of books that combined their 2 libraries. Hers ran to practical things and a few novels, his to history and surveying maps, and they developed the kind of domestic ease that is not exciting to describe, but is the actual substance of a happy life. They knew each other's habits. They knew where the silences were comfortable and where a word was wanted. They knew how to be in the same space without colliding. She did not stop missing Thomas. She had not expected to. But she found that the grief had changed its shape. It no longer had the jagged quality that cut unexpectedly, and it sat instead like a quieter, older ache that was part of her and was not incompatible with happiness. Paul understood this because he carried his own older ache, and they had spoken about it plainly enough in the autumn months that there was no mystery or threat in either direction. A man's capacity to love again, she had thought once, is not a betrayal of what he loved before. She thought the same was true of a woman. In late January, with February approaching and the baby's arrival imminent, a complication arose that sent a cold spike of fear through the warmth of those months. Rose woke one morning with a high fever that the midwife in Laramie, a capable, no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Harmon, who had delivered half the babies in the territory, said was likely from a chill she had taken in the cold, not from the pregnancy itself, but which needed to be watched carefully. Paul sat with her for 3 days of the fever, changing the cold compresses on her forehead, managing the house, keeping the fire steady, and when she was awake he read to her quietly, and when she slept he sat near and did not leave. He sent word to Edna Webb, who came over and helped during the days, bringing broth and sharp, cheerful practicality, and Mrs. Harmon checked in every morning and evening. The fever broke on the 4th day, leaving her weak but clear-headed, and when she woke to find Paul asleep in the chair by the bed, his chin on his chest, still dressed, she lay and looked at him for a long time before she made any sound that might wake him. He had not left. Through 3 days of fever and uncertainty, and the kind of fear that could not be managed by being practical about it, he had simply not left. When he woke and found her watching him, she said, "You need to sleep in a bed." "I know," he said, rubbing his face. "You have been in that chair for 3 days. I know that too, Paul." He looked at her. "Thank you," she said, and she meant the 3 days and also everything else, and she thought he understood that because he nodded in a way that was not dismissive of the weight of it. "I am not going anywhere," he said. "I would have thought that was established." "It is," she said. "I am just saying thank you anyway." The baby was born on the 12th of February, 1880. Exactly 2 years after Thomas had written his letter from Denver. He was a boy, solid and loud and absolutely certain of his own importance from the first moment, with a remarkable amount of dark hair for a newborn and eyes that would eventually settle into the same creek-water color as his mother's. Mrs. Harmon delivered him with her usual efficient expertise and declared him one of the best-behaved arrivals she had attended, by which she meant that the whole process, though difficult, went cleanly and without serious complication, and both mother and child were well at the end of it. Paul held his son for the first time standing by the window of the new bedroom, the baby wrapped in the blanket Rose's mother had sent from Nebraska when she had written to tell her the news, and the expression on his face was one that Rose burned into her memory with full, deliberate intention, because it was a face she intended to remember for the rest of her life. "He is very small," Paul said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He will not stay that way," Mrs. Harmon said from across the room, tidying her kit with professional briskness. "None of them do." "What shall we call him?" Paul asked, looking at Rose. She had been thinking about this. She said, "I thought James." "For no one in particular, just because it is a good solid name and it suits him." "James Graves," Paul said and tried it again. "James Graves." He looked at the baby. "He looks like a James." "He looks like a turnip at the moment," Mrs. Harmon said helpfully. "They all do. Give him a week." Rose laughed, which startled James, who let out a small sharp sound of protest, and then settled again against Paul's chest, and Paul looked so entirely undone with love that Rose had to press her fingers to her mouth. Spring came again, the second spring on the bottomland, and James Graves came with them on the first warm day of April, bundled against his mother in a carrier she had made from good canvas, sleeping with the profound indifference to weather that healthy babies have, while Rose and Paul walked the creek bank and checked the apple saplings, which had survived their first winter beautifully, and were putting out their second year of new growth with visible ambition. 2 years from now these will be tall enough to give shade, Paul said, looking at the tallest of the trees. 4 years from now the first blossoms, Rose said. 8 or 9 before a real fruit crop. Patient work. Good work, she corrected. The corn went in again in May, and this year she had expanded the planting by a full quarter-acre, and she had negotiated with the grain merchant for a forward contract that gave her a guaranteed price for a portion of the yield, which she had worked out sitting at the kitchen table with the ledger book open and James in the crook of her arm, calculating with the focused attention she brought to everything she cared about. Paul had watched her work through the numbers and said, "I think you missed a profession." "What profession?" "Running a trading company." She had snorted and gone back to the numbers, but privately she thought he might not be entirely wrong. The freight depot work was going well. Paul had been given responsibility for managing the full scheduling of the Laramie operation, which was a real promotion, and came with a meaningful increase in pay, and between the depot income and the growing bottomland yields, they were building the kind of financial solidity that turned a homestead from a survival situation into a genuine foundation. She paid Aldous Webb back for a fence repair he had done for her in the first lonesome winter, which he initially refused, and then accepted with the dignity of a man who understood what such a gesture meant. She wrote to her sister Nora in Nebraska, whom she had not seen in 3 years, and asked her to come for the summer. Nora arrived in June with her husband and their 2 small daughters, and the homestead was full of noise and children and evening meals eaten outside on blankets spread in the meadow. And James, at 4 months old, was passed between adoring arms and tolerated all of it with queenly patience, which was a contradiction in terms for a boy but was nevertheless accurate. Her sister met Paul and spent approximately 10 minutes assessing him before pulling Rose aside and saying, with the directness that ran in the family, "He is excellent." "I know," Rose said. "Thomas would have liked him." "I know that too." Nora looked at her for a moment. "You are happy," she said, as if confirming a diagnosis. "Yes," Rose said simply. "Good," said Nora, and went back to the blanket where Paul was attempting to teach her 4-year-old how to identify bird calls with mixed but enthusiastic results. The summer unfolded with the good fullness of a life that has found its proper shape. They rode out to the bottomland almost every day, and Rose began keeping a proper farm journal, recording the planting dates, and the germination rates, and the weather patterns and the soil conditions, building up a record that would serve her for years of future planning. She had never had the chance to be this systematic before, and she found it deeply satisfying, the way a good tool feels in the hand of a person who knows how to use it. James grew with the speed that all babies do, faster than seemed fair, faster than the apple trees, though she supposed that was as it should be. By late summer he was sitting up on his own with great satisfaction and beginning to find his voice, which he used with the freedom of someone who had never been told that silence was appropriate. One evening in August, after Nora and her family had gone back to Nebraska and the homestead was quieter again, though not unpleasantly so, Paul found Rose on the porch in the late evening, the farm journal open in her lap, a lamp burning beside her, and he sat down next to her and looked at what she was writing. "You are planning the orchard expansion," he said. "I want to add 6 more trees next spring, different varieties. If the first 12 take hold well through this winter, there is room on the upper slope for another row." "There is," he agreed. He looked at her profile in the lamplight for a moment. "Rose, I want to say something." She looked up from the journal. He was looking at her with that quiet steadiness, but tonight there was something in it that was less settled and more openly warm, the way the fire looks when you add a new log and the light brightens before it steadies. "I know what I have now," he said. "I know it clearly. I did not think after Margaret, after the years of moving, I did not think this was possible for me. I thought the wanting of it might be the end of it, that wanting something that specific and that real was a kind of luxury I had run out of." He paused. "I was wrong about that, and I am glad every single day that I was wrong about it." She reached over and put her hand over his there on the porch rail. "Thomas sent you," she said. "Thomas sent me," he agreed. "Best freight delivery I ever made." She laughed, and he laughed, and James woke up inside and made his presence known, and she went in to tend to him while Paul blew out the lamp on the porch, and the August night was warm and full of stars and crickets and the far-off sound of the creek, and the homestead sat steady in the dark, as it had been sitting for years and would go on sitting for many more. In October of 1880, almost exactly 2 years after Paul had first ridden up the dirt road with a package on the back of his horse, Rose made a decision about the bottomland property that she had been turning over in her mind for months. She took the money she had saved from 2 seasons of corn yields and the produce sales and the egg money from her expanded flock, and she commissioned a proper survey of the South Valley land. And then she began the process of formally registering her intention to build a permanent structure on the property. Not a simple cabin, but a real farmhouse, with a good foundation and a root cellar, positioned on the rise above the floodplain with a view down the full length of the valley. Paul looked at the plans she had drawn, rough but accurate, with dimensions marked in her careful hand, and said, "This is ambitious." "Yes," she said. "When do you want to start?" "Spring," she said. "If we are going to build it, we should build it properly, and a spring start gives us the full season." He studied the plans, tracing the dimensions with one finger. "The foundation will need to be deep because of the frost line in the valley, and the root cellar will add time." "I know, that is why I want to start in April." He looked at her. "We are going to need help." "I know that too. I was thinking Aldous and his son could give us the first 2 weekends, and I have spoken to a carpenter in Laramie who is willing to take on the framing and roof work for a fair price." Paul folded his hands on the table and looked at her with the expression she had learned to read as deep appreciation combined with mild exasperation at being slightly outpaced. "You have already spoken to the carpenter. I had to know whether it was feasible before I brought it to you as a serious proposal. Have I ever given you any reason to think I would not take your proposal seriously?" She considered. "No." "Then next time talk to me before the carpenter." She smiled. "I will take that under advisement." He shook his head, but he was smiling too. "April," he said. "We start in April." The winter of 1880 to 1881 was a hard one, colder than the previous winter and longer, with heavy snows that came early and stayed. They were prepared for it. The wood was laid in, the animals properly sheltered, the provisions stocked, and while the cold was serious, it did not find them lacking. James took his first steps in November, staggering between his parents in the kitchen, with an expression of profound determination that made both of them laugh with the particular helpless love of parents, watching a child accomplish something momentous. By January he was walking everywhere, and by February he was beginning to have opinions about where he wanted to go, which were not always convenient opinions but were enthusiastically held. They read to him in the evenings, simple things at first, rhymes and short stories, and he sat between them on the settle near the fire with the focused intensity of someone receiving important information. And Rose thought of Thomas's letter and its careful optimism, and she felt the full weight of how much had come from that package, that letter, that last thoughtful act of a man who had loved her honestly and known her truly. The farmhouse on the bottomland began construction in April of 1881, as planned. The carpenter from Laramie, a German-born craftsman named Heinrich Bauer, turned out to be a person of exceptional competence and a pleasing directness that Rose respected immediately. He arrived on the first Monday of April with 2 apprentices and a full set of proper tools, looked at Rose's plans, suggested 3 modifications that improved the design without changing its fundamental character, and began work that same morning. Aldous Webb and his son came for the foundation pour and the framing weekends, and Paul took a week off from the depot to work alongside Bauer's crew on the critical early stages. Rose managed the homestead during the workdays and came down to the building site in the afternoons, James on her hip or toddling beside her on the uneven ground, to check progress and consult with Bauer on the finished details. The walls went up in May. The roof went on in June, a good cedar shake roof that Bauer installed with the care of someone who understood that the roof was what stood between everything you valued and the Wyoming sky. The root cellar was dug in July, deeper than Paul had even planned for, with proper stone lining that would keep the temperature steady through the worst winters. By August, the farmhouse was standing complete on the rise above the valley. A real house, solid and square, with 4 rooms and a proper kitchen and a porch that ran the full length of the south face, looking out over the bottomland and the creek and the 2 rows of apple trees, which were now, after 2 growing seasons, tall enough to give a person some sense of what the orchard would look like in 10 years. They did not move out of the homestead immediately. The homestead was paid for and stable and closer to the depot, and Paul still held the depot position, which they had decided to keep for the income security. But they began using the farmhouse on the bottomland as their primary working base, and on weekends and long summer evenings they were there on the porch, watching the valley in its different lights, planning the next season, talking about the things they intended to do and the things they had already done. One evening in late August of 1881, sitting on the new porch with the first harvest of apples from the 2 most precocious trees in a bowl between them, small apples, not yet the full flavor they would be in another 5 years, but recognizably themselves, sweet and tart and real, Rose told Paul there would be another baby. He was eating an apple and he stopped mid-bite. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. He finished the apple in silence. Then he set the core carefully on the porch rail and looked at her with the full warmth of someone who has received news that is completely good. "James will be 2.5 by then," he said, calculating. "About that, yes." "He will be a terrible older brother," Paul said fondly. "He will be a wonderful older brother," Rose said. "He has excellent fundamentals." Paul leaned over and kissed her temple, and she leaned into him slightly, and they sat on the porch of the farmhouse they had built on the land Thomas had given her, watching the apple trees in the evening light, and the bottomland was rich and green around them, and the creek ran silver in the last of the day's sun. The second baby arrived in April of 1882, on a mild spring morning, and she was a girl with her father's dark eyes and her mother's direct, uncompromising gaze, and they named her Clara, for Rose's friend in Laramie who had come to the wedding and wept with such enthusiasm, and because it was a good clear name that suited the small, definite person who arrived with it. James, who had been prepared for the baby's arrival through months of careful explanation, met his sister with a wariness that transformed over the first 3 days into a proprietary affection that had Paul quietly laughing on multiple occasions and Rose slightly alarmed at the intensity of it. "He is very attached," Paul said. "He will be protective," Rose said. "He tried to give her his apple this morning. She cannot eat apples. He was unconcerned with that." Clara thrived through the spring and summer, and James accepted her presence as a settled fact of his world with the pragmatism of children, and the farmhouse on the bottomland was full in the evenings with the particular rich noise of a family that is genuinely present with itself. Paul's depot position continued to develop. By the end of 1882, he had been offered a partnership stake in the operation, which would mean more responsibility and also a share of the profits rather than simply a wage. They discussed it at the kitchen table of the farmhouse for 2 evenings, going through the numbers carefully, weighing the risk against the opportunity, and they decided yes, with a carefulness about the terms that Paul negotiated with the company owners over 3 weeks of correspondence before signing anything. The corn yields in 1882 were the best yet. the bottomland continuing to give back generously for what they put into it, and the apple orchard was beginning to look, for the first time, like something that would in a few years become what she had imagined. A proper orchard, the trees well-shaped and strong, their canopies spreading, the blossoms in May spectacular with bees. She went to the old homestead regularly, keeping it in good repair, because it was still their land and still a useful base, and because she could not quite bring herself to let it go. There were years of her life in those walls, years of difficulty and grief and survival, and the slow rebuilding of herself. And while she lived primarily in the farmhouse now, the homestead had a significance she intended to honor. One October afternoon, standing in the kitchen of the old homestead for no particular reason, she took Thomas's photograph from the mantel and looked at it for a long time. She and Thomas in Nebraska, young, newly married. His hand on her shoulder, her chin tilted slightly up, both of them squinting a little against the photographer's light. She thought about the letter, the thimble, the deed, the gentle, extraordinary care of a man making sure she would be all right, even from the edge of his own mortality. She set the photograph back on the mantel, and then she looked around the kitchen, at the window Paul had repaired, at the table where he had first sat with his hat in his hands, at the chair where he had refilled her coffee cup without making a production of it. Both of them had shaped this place. Both of them were in these walls. That was not a contradiction. It was, she thought, exactly what Thomas would have wanted. She went back to the farmhouse in the valley, and Paul was on the porch with the children, James running in circles in the grass, while Clara watched him from the security of her father's arms with the expression of someone monitoring an entertaining but slightly unpredictable phenomenon. Rose came up the porch steps and Paul looked at her with his steady, warm look, and she sat beside him and put her head on his shoulder and looked out over the bottomland, the corn harvested now, and the field turned for winter, the apple trees dressed in their October red and gold, the creek running clear and silver in the afternoon light. "All right?" Paul asked. "More than all right," she said. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, and Clara, with perfect timing, made a sound of vocal approval, and James, who had been mid-circle, stopped to look at his parents with a 4-year-old's pragmatic assessment of sentimentality, and then went back to his running. The years that followed were good ones, full ones, the kind that accumulate quietly into a life that is indisputably itself. The freight depot partnership grew and became the primary business for a northern Wyoming freight corridor, and Paul's position in it made him well known and respected in Laramie and its surrounding towns. The bottomland farm became, over time, exactly what Rose had planned in those first careful evenings by the fire. A real producing farm with a proper orchard, a good corn yield, a kitchen garden that was the envy of everyone in the valley, and a root cellar that Bauer had built so well that it was still perfectly functional a decade later. Rose kept the farm journal she had started in the second summer and added to it every year, and by the time James was old enough to read it, he found in its pages not just a record of soil conditions and planting dates, but a portrait of two people building something from nothing, in the way that the best things are built, with patience and work and the willingness to trust what could not yet be seen. He read it by the lamp in the kitchen of the farmhouse, at the same table where his parents had made so many of their plans, and when he finished he went to find his mother where she was checking the apple trees at dusk, the orchard now tall and full and producing, the kind of orchard that makes a person feel that time has been well spent. "You planned all of this from the beginning," he said. "The farmhouse, the orchard, everything." "I planned it," she said, inspecting a branch with a careful eye. "Paul and I planned it together, but you started it before Paul came." "I started it," she agreed, "but some things are better built with someone." He was quiet for a moment, thinking about this with the seriousness of a young man encountering an idea that will stay with him. "Who told you Paul was coming?" he asked. "How did you know he would be someone worth building with?" Rose looked at her son, who had Thomas's broad forehead and Paul's steady eyes, which was a combination that she found she loved without reservation, and she thought about a Tuesday morning in October of 1878, a rider coming up a dirt road, a package wrapped in brown paper. "Your father sent him," she said. "Your first father, Thomas. He sent Paul with a package before he died, and the package changed everything." She paused. "I did not know at the time. I thought it was just a kindness, one last thing taken care of. But it was three things: the land, the photograph, the thimble." She touched the pocket where she still sometimes carried her mother's silver thimble, warm and small and real. "And Paul, who was never in the package but came with it anyway." James looked at her for a long moment. "That is a good story," he said. "It is the best one I know," she said. The orchard was heavy with apples that autumn, the best year yet, 8 varieties now. The original 12 trees plus the 6 she had added 2 springs after the farmhouse was built, all of them mature and productive. They picked apples for 3 solid days, Rose and Paul and James and Clara, who at 10 years old had strong opinions about which trees needed attention first, and implemented them with her mother's directness. They made apple butter and apple preserves and dried rings for winter, and Rose baked 3 apple pies that were, she thought, as good as anything she had tasted in her life. They ate supper on the porch that last evening of the apple harvest, the whole family, the valley going golden around them in the autumn dusk, and it was such a complete thing. The table, the food from their own land, the children, Paul across the table from her with the same steady warmth he had brought to everything for all these years, that she sat for a moment without moving and simply held it. Paul looked up from his plate and met her eyes, and he smiled, that full, warm smile she had first seen in her kitchen when he made some small joke about Thomas's faith in her stubbornness, and she smiled back. There was nothing dramatic in the moment. There was nothing that needed saying. The apple trees stood in their rows in the valley below, shaped by years of careful tending into exactly what she had imagined them to be. The creek ran steady and clear. The farmhouse behind them was solid and warm, Bower's roof still sound above them after all these years. The children argued companionably about which apple variety was best, James maintaining a passionate position on the matter while Clara dismissed his reasoning with methodical efficiency. Paul reached across the table and touched her hand briefly, and she turned her palm up and held his hand for a moment, the way they had held hands on that first real evening of understanding between them, on the trail back from the bottomland through the October dusk, all those years and harvests ago. She had come west because Thomas Grady had brought her, and she had stayed because this land was home, and she had built something real from the very ground up because that was what she was made of. And sitting here on the porch of the farmhouse on the land that Thomas had given her as a final gift, with the man Thomas had sent to check on her now, the man who sat across her supper table every evening, and had helped her build every apple tree and every fence line and every plan, she felt the full, undiminished weight of a life that had arrived, through grief and uncertainty and careful choosing, at exactly the right place. The stars came out, one by one, as the valley went dark, the same enormous Wyoming stars that had always looked close enough to touch, and the apple harvest was done, and the children went inside eventually, and the creek ran on in the dark below the orchard, and Paul and Rose sat a while longer on the porch in the good warm quiet of everything they had made together, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was exactly what both of them had come to from very different roads, hoping to find.